Hi everybody, I'm Dave Bitter. I'm a developer advocate and front-end developer at I/O, which you see on all the banners. And today I want to have a talk about Remix. Remix, the framework. I will promise you this is not going to be a README talk, because I usually hate those. Like, yeah, you just listed up the entire README. But there's some practical examples of what Remix stands for, how you use it, and we're going to talk a lot about the web. Not just JavaScript, but the web. So, who here works with React, Next, all these single-page frameworks? Yes. Who thinks they sometimes suck? Yes. Yes, same. It's usually the same. No, definitely. No, that's usually what we see. So let's see if we can find something better, if we can truly work with the platform instead of against it. So Remix is a full-stack web, and there's a reason that's in bold, framework based on web fundamentals. We're going to talk a lot about the web. What Remix also is a framework to build over-engineered websites, according to an anonymous guy on the internet. Because I tweeted out that I liked it really this much. So a guy reached out, he said, well, it's built for over-engineered websites, and you don't know the difference between a website and a native app. Don't tell my boss, who's also sitting here. Sending it from the Twitter web app, right? And I don't blame the guy. I mean, if you look at, for instance, a Twitter, especially on a mobile version, how different is it from a native app from the web version? So these lines got very blurry, which makes sense. And even this guy who wanted to call me out didn't know that. Of course, I responded because I needed an intro for my talk, so I did. I said, hey, well, guy on the internet, you can actually look these tweets up. I think, yeah, sure, I feel your pain, but I think the nice thing about Remix is that it actually uses the platform called the web. So it's not JavaScript, 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 it's actually, okay, how do we do this on the web? How do we use the browser? And that's a bit of a shift, right? Instead of putting everything in JavaScript, say, okay, well, where is this going to run? On the web, what does it already still offer? Let's use that. Kind of like the talk this morning from Kirill, who showed a lot of these examples. So yeah, I might actually find Remix interesting. Of course you didn't. Let's be clear about that. We're still talking about web apps, and there's no such thing, right? Websites have a URL, apps are standalone program, there's really this black and white. Well, naturally, it's not there. It's gray. These lines are blurry and getting blurrier by the second, which is fine. But how can we then actually use the web as it is intended? Of course, I didn't agree with him on Twitter because I always want to win an internet argument. So definitely, yeah, sure, but we can run progressive web apps. But there's something interesting in this. I'm continuously referring to, okay, well, let's enhance it layer by layer. Let's just use the web, then enhance it for modern UX. Then maybe you need PWA, but let's not start with that. But tell me you're frustrated by all these JavaScript frameworks without telling me you're frustrated. And that's why I asked at the start. I feel the same frustration sometimes. Because we all got this friend who says, you should totally come to this party, and this person is going to be there, and you should see the lineup that we are going to have there. It's all good vibes, super happy, super positive. This is your coworker on Monday morning. And new frameworks sometimes feel like this. You get FOMO, like, hey, am I still relevant if I don't pick this up? But you often run into the same issues you had with the last framework that person was really passionate about. These are just some arbitrary points that I'm going to make when the party is no longer fun, right? Suddenly, yeah, okay, the README is fine, it's a super simple app, but I got very complex state because I have a very difficult application. Oh, this uses non-standard, so I need to really onboard all the developers at my company, so on and so on. I can make a lot of these points. And to me, this is where Remix comes in. So it basically will give you the tools to use the web as a platform, and then enhance for modern UX. So it gives you both those tools. We're going to look at that today. First, let's look at this logo. I think during the COVID lockdown, I think everybody hears the calling sound right now, which was the worst, right? But it helped us out. So when you're on the Scrum team, you probably do something with like Scrum Poker, where you all say, well, I think this is 5 story points. Doing that online on Teams with crappy connections, blurry images, standing like this didn't work very well. There are a lot of apps out there that will just give you this online, but where's the fun in that? We're developers, so let's see if we can build something like this, which can get quite complex quite quickly, using Remix. So a couple of features that we need to build is basically, well, you need to create or join a session. That's the first thing. Then you will need to be able to cast a vote. You're looking at a user story. We need to refactor this entire button component. This is what I think how many story points that are. You need to, as an admin, toggle the visibility, right? At the end of the round, you say, okay, now everybody can view. And at the end, you clear the round to start over again. 4 simple features, usually quite complex when you actually build it. So let's get the party started. The lineup, or the tech stack, but I wanted to be in the team, is Remix, naturally, that's why we're all here. Then I need to persist some data. Usually I use Firebase. I think that, well, that's a whole different talk. But you have Supabase, which is the Firebase alternative, as they market it. Works great for these demos. And Tailwind to just quickly mock up some UI. So how does that look like? Well, a bit like this. It's a form, nothing really special. You can basically create a new session by giving your name and then starting it, or join a session by giving it a session ID and your name. Then, when you're with your team, you might have a UI something like this, where you can actually interact with the applications, you can see what everybody voted, and you can share. So Remix uses file-based routing, and I think we all know that, especially with Next. I think for a lot of React developers that came up, at least for me, that came up a lot. But we basically use file-based routing. So we have a folder called routes with an index, which is an index.html. Then we have a folder called session with a dynamic part, the $sign, which is /session/whatever. Super basic stuff. You can do a lot of cool things here, and it's actually all moving, for instance, to React Router. It's moving to Next pretty soon. By all means, Remix didn't invent it. There was a whole Twitter riot about that, which I can share afterwards maybe. Please look it up. You can do amazing things. But you can find that in the README. So let's look at actually building something. So when we have this page, the first thing that we have is a form. How does a form look like? Like this. It's a form. It has a label, an input, and a submit button. Usually when we create these forms in React, now we start to add all these things. We started to add on-click handlers, on-submit handlers, then we prevent it, and we have some state of the entire form. Then we need to send it to an API, which you need an API key for, or there's course issues, or whatnot. This is all we need, I promise you. We do import a form there at the top from Remix. All that does underwater is just render a normal HTML5 form. But it will enable us to do some client-side stuff as an enhancement, which we'll come to. But that's it. What happens if I now submit this in a Create React app, and I think even in the next app? I don't know. Where does it post to? There's probably no route. Well, maybe you provide a server somewhere, you put an action there, you say, oh, post here, but it's not in the framework. How do I actually post a form? And that's a pretty rudimentary feature of the web. I just need to post a form. So how can we do that? We can do that by exporting in this file, and I will have simplified code snippets, by the way. We'll export something that's called an action. There's an action you're taking, you're posting a form. And that's basically a function that runs on the server. So when you post, it will push the request to that. So somewhere in this file, you do something like this. You say, okay, I'm going to export a function that's called action. And Remix will pick this up and say, okay, well, suddenly when anybody posts on this route, I need to call this. So here we get the request object, which is great. And in that request object, we will find the form data. This is how we, or at least I did, forms a while back. We just had a request coming in. We're using it. So what we can do here now is say, well, maybe create a new session ID. Fun tip, use something like human readable IDs. It's a bit nicer for your users to share instead of this super long thing, especially for this demo. Then we say, okay, Supabase client, doesn't really matter. It's an SDK from Supabase. We insert a new session. Great. Then the cool stuff happens. So this is the basic stuff. This works without JavaScript, of course. It's just, it posts, it makes an actual request in your browser, you can handle it, and then you can do something. So you return either a redirect, and well, that redirects. That's what it does, probably to the session page in our app logic. But you can also return something that's an object. And in that object, you can put anything you want. For instance, there's an error. What do we need to do now? How do I access this? I have this little hook called use action data, and that's by Remix, that's from their package. If we call this use action data, the first time the page renders on the server, it's empty, of course. But when I post on this route and I return something in my action, this will be filled. Whether you have client-side JavaScript or not, right? If your page refreshes, it will still be filled on the server. So you can render, for instance, your error. I didn't put the logic there, but I can imagine that you render some text there. So what happens if we have client-side JavaScript? I don't need to change anything. It just does it on the client. Right? It will still post to the backend, but it won't do a hard refresh, basically. And that's everything for forms. So that's how you can add this interactivity. Super simple example, but you can imagine it is super simple, right? We have forms, we have the web, we post, we get a response. I can already hear you. Yeah, but all my users have JavaScript, right? And I get that. Most likely they will. I think maybe some people will build applications where it's not so given. But generally that's the consensus. Like, yeah, but we have JavaScript and we'll just still build it there. And I like this tweet. It's a very old tweet. It's from 2012. Very old. It makes us feel old. This is 10 years ago. Where it said, well, we don't have non-JavaScript users. No, they're all still when they're loading it. So sure, right? They will load it. It will be fine. In which case, they will go into a tunnel. The JavaScript's not loaded. Doesn't really convince. But then I gave the same talk about a week back in Eindhoven with one of my colleagues who is maybe in this room, so I won't mention their name. But they also made a remix app, which is great. And he wanted to showcase to me. Didn't touch it in 4 months. The app crashed. The client-side JavaScript crashed. So I'm not saying Remix will solve all your problems. If you write client-side JavaScript, it can still break. What happens is the entire screen goes white. It's like, oh, never mind, I need to fix it. We're like, no. Let's just turn off the JavaScript. Let's just turn it off. And suddenly you see this entire app come to life because it still worked. If you really use these remix techniques, it still works. You have a server-side variant. Naturally, that doesn't mean you just turn off JavaScript ever. Well, kudos if you do. But it goes to show the more logic you put on the client, the more JavaScript that you load, higher chances that something might break, which will really screw up your page. And with that, the entire user flow. So that's a form. What if we have 2 forms? Because I just said, well, whenever I post on this route, it's going to go to that one action. Can I do 2 actions? Can I specify it? Well, no, you can't. But you can use a very old trick, which is a hidden input. Is it a hack? Is it a trick? Is it a feature? Basically a hidden input where we say, okay, this particular form is the join session form. So what we can then do on the action, so on the server, we can say, well, basically get that form type, make a case switch out of it, do your logic. Super simple stuff to handle. Okay, I get that creating forms is not the most exciting thing that we do here as front-enders. So let's have a look at the dynamic session page, because this is usually where these frameworks don't hold up, right? There's a lot of logic now, and we need to be able to add that. Multiple parts here. We have some data at the top. We just need to get the latest state, let's call it that, from the database of this particular session. We have an interactive bit. Well, if you're an admin, you can show the votes, you can clear the round. And at the bottom, we have something to basically copy an invite, because, yeah, well, if you need to send this to your team, you need a way to do that. Let's have a look at that. All this basically does, when you do copy invite, is put this on your clipboard. Works great. Fun fact, if you do this on mobile, we use the native web share API, because that will just open a better UI to share on native, right? And then, naturally, if you don't have client-side JavaScript, well, maybe just put a link there so people can manually copy it, whatever you want to do. So what happens now? We had that original page with the forms, and what we used to have to do is, maybe with React, at least in the client with a use effect, say, okay, what are the search parameters? And then based on the search parameters, say, oh, well, I want to maybe hide the join session, or sorry, show the join session, but hide the create a session form, because that doesn't make sense. My intent is to join something, I don't want to create something. What happens is that your page renders with both forms, then it makes makes the choice to hide this one, so you get this flash of UI, which is really annoying, which you don't want. But we don't actually need any client-side JavaScript because we have this use search params hook. This is basically the pattern that Remix uses for everything. It's just a hook, you call it. So when the user comes in, it's first going to render this HTML or JSX on the server. It's going to see, well, there's a join session ID, so maybe not send this first form to the user. Just do the second one. Why not make it even smarter? Maybe pre-fill the session ID there, autofocus on the name input, make a nicer UX. All of this on the server, which is great. So now the page looks a bit like this when you pass that param in there. You can type your name, you hit enter, it will submit and redirect. It will redirect to this page. So let's see how we can actually load some data instead of just posting. So when we load some data, well, first we used an action, and now we use a loader. Does exactly the same. User comes in, navigates to a page. On the server, this loader kicks off. It's an async function. Well, you, for instance, get the latest state of the current session. Might redirect if the session doesn't exist, based on your logic. And in the end, when you have the data, you return it. Well, you guessed it, you have the use action data. You also have a use loader data. So based on this loader, you can get the data, render your page on the server, send it to the client. No client-side JavaScript needed. If you know next, you know get server-side props. It's exactly the same. But now the real challenge. We need to add some interactivity, mainly this little bit. So this entire section, where I like to see it, 3 different sections, is basically 3 forms, microforms, whatever you want to call them. We need to be able to cast a vote. We need to be able, as an admin, to toggle the votes, and we need to be able to reset the round. I can already, normally, when I build this, it's like, oh, shit, yeah, okay, then I have a bunch of state, maybe, that I need to show, and then I have on-click handlers, I need to call an API. Now, let's see how we can do this without any client-side JavaScript. Yes, you can write this a bit neater than I did for this demo. But basically, for the first part, for casting a vote, we just have radio buttons. Because radio buttons do everything that I want to. There's only one that can be active at a time. When I click a new one, the old one becomes inactive. Build your UI around it. That worked great. No state, just a radio button. It's just a form that I'm going to post. But you can imagine, every time you hit, for instance, 5, you have to click submit, and then 8, submit, because you don't have client-side JavaScript, you need to submit this form. It's really annoying. So we introduce some client-side JavaScript, something called useSubmit. All this does is basically say submit on a form, programmatically. So how can we use this? Well, we can say when there's a change, don't prevent default, because we want a default. We want it to submit, that's the whole point. But submit this current form. And I said, don't use client-side JavaScript. Yes. By all means, use client-side JavaScript, but in this way. We first have this solid base. It's a simple form. It works. We can test it. We could already ship it, which is a nice added benefit. And afterwards, you can basically put a light layer on top, client-side JavaScript, that will handle this. But now, of course, we have that little submit button, which is also ugly, which you don't want to show. So how can we basically hide this little submit button if there is client-side JavaScript? Well, with CSS, because basically saying, well, there's client-side JavaScript or not, how are you going to determine it? You can do this nicer, just to give an idea. You add some CSS to maybe hide or show some UI elements based on whether it has JavaScript or not. Add a little animation delay, because of course you don't want it to be hidden. There's JavaScript and then it suddenly shows, or the other way around, which is annoying. Let's give our bundle half a second to load, should be fine, as we have a very small bundle. Cool, so now we have this submit button when there's no client-side JavaScript, otherwise we hide it. So let's look at these other 2 buttons, because how am I going to create toggles if I don't want to use client-side JavaScript, and just basically forms, by making basically forms, using the same hidden input trick as before. So I have 2 forms. One of them is called toggle the effort, the other one is clear the effort. I submit it, my backend logic can still handle it. Incredibly simple. So far, I used the username as a query parameter using my demo, which is not the greatest because I can take your name and then update your value, which developers will definitely do. So let's add some authentication, basically. Well, I get that you don't want to give me your personal data. Why would you? You're just trying to do some Scrum poker app. Do we need fancy libraries or whatnot for this? No, we use, well, Remix, but underwater we use server sessions. They work pretty well. I can create a server session. Basically, here's some helper code. And what I can do is basically, when you open your browser, you have a session. And in that session, you have some unique ID. And I can use that. So let's say you create a new session. I can say, OK, for this session ID, store a user ID and a username in that session. And generally, these things don't need to persist very long, right? You're done with your Scrum Poker event. You probably close it, never look back. So here we can store that. And then on the server side, in an action, we can actually also use it. So how does that look like? Well, for instance, here, I say, well, in my current session, get for this session ID the user. And then I can basically use that to just cast a vote on behalf of you. Or when you are an admin or not, I might want to be able to toggle or not. Can take it even a bit further. So because we have all of this stuff on the server, which is really nice and not on the client, we can also easily say, well, maybe we don't need to expose everything. Maybe I don't want to expose somebody's admin ID. Just don't return it, right? It sounds simple, but usually you kind of forget. It's like, OK, whatever, I'll just put the data in there. No, what data do you actually need? Probably somebody's username, their vote, and nothing more. Maybe your own, not sure. So making it a bit more secure, basically I said, hey, Superbase, block everything. Block your entire, whenever somebody tries to call this, just block it. And how do I then do it? Well, because I have everything on the server, I have all my mutations there on an action. I have all the data that I want to retrieve. I have that in loaders. Well, maybe I can say, block everything, use this super special token that I'm not going to show here on screen, of course, and use that to query and override those policies. That's it. Made it a bit more secure. But sure, it feels a bit slow, because you can imagine you hit one of the radio buttons. It's going to go to the back end. It's going to post it to Superbase. Superbase is going to update the database. It's going to send it back. I'm going to send something back, UI updates. It's really annoying when you just want to click and you want to see, hey, this works. So we can use something that's called optimistic UI, which is not a new pattern. It's something we used a lot. But Remix offers a cool tool for that. So in essence, what optimistic UI is, well, when you cast a vote, I'm fairly certain that it will go through. Right? If it doesn't, sure, we can handle that, but I'm fairly certain that it will work. So can't we already get that data and already update the UI? We can, otherwise I would have made this slide. We can add something called use transition. And what this basically does is whenever there's a form on this, in this file that is actually submitting or not, we get an update of the state of that form. So we can listen to the transition.state, and then basically make a case switch here where we say, oh, when you're submitting, by the way, pull that effort out of there. Maybe I want to do something with it. For now, I added some client-side state saying, OK, I have the optimistic vote, but whenever it's idling, so it's done, basically set it back to null and use whatever it needs to. So this works by one OR statement there. I should have added a little line there. One OR statement where we say the active user effort is either, if there's an optimistic vote, use that. Otherwise, just use the default loader one. Cool. That works. So it's a bit quicker for the user, and I think that's nice. OK, so now we need to go real time. You can imagine you need some client-side JavaScript for this, but that's fine. But we need to basically build a layer on top of our entire application. And we want to do it as easily as possible. So we need this, well, to get updates from everybody's vote, but also an admin who might toggle it, clear it around, so on, so on. So do we need a lot for this? No, actually 2 little bits, because we built in a progressively enhanced manner. So build something that's called the Superbase real-time hook. All it does is basically use the SDK to say, OK, you're going to receive a query here. So for instance, listen to the session and then this session ID, that query, and then there's a callback. That callback will contain the updated data. I thought, well, great. Somebody makes an update. I receive, well, they voted 6. I put some updates, a local array of my state, put it in there. Suddenly I had issues, right? Because they didn't came in at the right moment. I had it from all these sources. I was struggling, having weird bugs. And then I thought, well, I don't really care what I get in. I just care about the latest state. And I know that's in a database somewhere. And I know I already written that logic in the loader the first time the page load. Can't I just use that? Well, you can. We use this hook. And then we say, create a use fetcher. And I promise this is the last hook that I'm going to show. And basically what you can do with this use fetcher is say, it's first time the page renders on the server, it's going to be empty. So we use the loader data votes. What we can now do is say, in our callback, whenever something updates, just rerun that loader. Just give me the latest state. And that's it. That's the entire real-time bit of my entire application. I think that's nice about building it this way. We first build a super solid base that even works without JavaScript. And then we can add these light layers. I mean, this is the entire complexity of my entire app. This is the trickiest part. I think that's very, very powerful. So, of course, yeah, it's a pixelated photo, but it's also photos of colleagues of mine, so it's a bug or a feature. We went for a test run. We had a Scrum session. Well, you can imagine that some developers put drop table and those usernames in through with you, which is fine, and luckily I was guarded against that. But more importantly, suddenly I had 8, 9 machines, and everybody, oh, well, let's try this UI out. And I got all these updates coming in, and all these loaders re-triggering and calling Superbase. And of course, I use, yeah, that's pretty Dutch, the free Superbase, because I don't want to pay for it. So that's a problem. And then I was thinking, well, is it a problem? Because we already have the optimistic UI, so for me it's fast, regardless. Superbase can take half a minute. For me it's fast. I click something, it updates. When another person updates their UI, you don't know when they clicked. If that's a second ago or 100 milliseconds ago, are you going to be able to tell the difference? So I just throttled basically the request, say just whatever, throttle it by a second. And that got rid of a lot of requests, I can tell you. Really cool. Some notes is that usually when we look at Remix, and that's, I think, also not so nice of READMEs or README talks, if you call it like that. You look into Remix, it's like, oh, this stuff is really good at forms. Yeah, it is really good at forms, but it's not just a sign-up form. Most likely you have all these interactive bits in your application, which underwater, let's be real, it's usually just a form with radio buttons, checkboxes, regular inputs. You might have a button with a toggle. Remix is really good if you work smart with it to work on that. Secondly, I don't have any client-side state. I have that little optimistic vote, sure, it's an enhancement. I have no client-side state. No client-side state, I promise you. Yes, Remix underwater, the loader data might have some client-side state, but I'm not dependent on it. It's not that I update that state with my logic, because what happens, you have client-side state, so you're like, oh yeah, now it's getting complex, you need Redux. Okay, we had Redux. Oh, then we need all these plugins. And then oh no, we use this pattern here at our company. A new person needs to be on board. It gets super complex. By moving this to the back end, a little bit of extra steps. You might take a performance hit here and there. My front end is so incredibly easy once you get the hang of, okay, let's just bring it back to basically forms, loaders, actions. To have less error prone and not have my entire application break because I created some bug somewhere. And doing this by using web fundamentals. I like to use web fundamentals first. I think we sometimes kind of forget it, how powerful the web is as a platform itself, how really good it can handle things like forms, and we hardly ever use it. Prevent default. Let's not do it. I'm just going to do a fetch. I'm just going to post. Let's use the web as the way it's intended instead of fighting against it. But naturally, and I can hear you thinking, yes, but we have use case X, Y, Z. Yeah, enhance, definitely. You will need client-side JavaScript. I'm actually pretty a React fanboy, but I'm not saying don't use client-side JavaScript. I say first cover your bases, then get fancy. And it's not about Remix itself, which is a weird slide to put at the end of an entire talk about Remix. I get that. but it's what's behind the framework itself, what's the thought behind this. And you will see, if you hear the creators of it talk about it, if you read up on their documentation, if you see people talking about it, it's usually, yeah, no, we want to work with the web. It's the web platform. For now, it's Remix. It might be some other framework in the future, but at least, yeah, let's try to see if we can actually use our beloved web as the way it's intended. You can find me when you Google Dave Bitter. You can find me everywhere, me and an American banker who is 46 years old, so I think you will find me. If you're interested in stuff like this, more experimental stuff, but also more on Remix, you can visit either my website or techup.iodigital.com, where we actually have some content about this as well, and actually also a workshop where we go over a day and we see, okay, how can we work with this and actually build a complete application. And with that, I want to say thank you.